Ethel Carrier. Okay. Good evening. I'm Ethel Carrier. I'm a member of Congregation Beth Tikva in Carlisle. Welcome to the third program in Jewish Ethics series, Jewish Ethics and War, under the auspices of the Central Pennsylvania Small Congregations Initiative, which brings together 15 congregations from the region. The conveyors of this group are Jewish Community Foundation of Central Pennsylvania and the Jewish Community Legacy Project. A few logistical details. This program will be recorded. It will be saved on the JCLP YouTube channel. Everyone will be muted with the exception of the speakers. And if for some reason you become unmuted, please hit your mute button. I encourage you to submit your questions via the chat. If not answered by the end of the program, we will send them to you after the meeting. There's no more timely and relevant topic as Jewish ethics and the war with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we have no greater group of experts as in this evening's program. Our keynote speaker, Rabbi Michael Boy Bernstein, is a professor of law at Emory University School of Law, the director of the SJD program, and Berman Projects Director at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He is also a core faculty member of the Tam Institute of Jewish Studies at Emory. His primary areas of interest are law and religion, Jewish law and ethics, family law, and comparative religious law. In addition to his many books, Rabbi Boy has written more than 250 articles and book chapters on various aspects of law and religion, Jewish law and religious ethics, as well as an often cited article on impeachment in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. He has written on military ethics from a Jewish law view, marriage and divorce in the Jewish tradition, bioethical dilemmas from a religious view, women's rights in the Jewish tradition, the general relationship between secular and Jewish law in its many different facets, and many other topics. Following Rabbi Broy's presentation, we will have responses and a dialogue from Rabbi Broy from two panelists from our community. Michael S. Nieberg is professor of history and chair of war studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He has published work specializes on the First and Second World Wars in global context. The Wall Street Journal named his Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War I, that was Harvard University Press 2011, one of the 5 best books ever written about that war. And Rabbi Ilan Pardo is the spiritual leader of Congregation Sons of Israel in Chambersburg. He is an Israeli by birth and served in several military theaters of war, including Lebanon and the West Bank. And so it's my pleasure now to call on Rabbi Broy.
Thank you very much, all. It's so nice of everybody to come out virtually to an evening of thinking. We are blessed to be part of a large Jewish community that thinks about hard topics, and sometimes just the act of thinking about a hard topic sensitizes you to the complex ethical issues involved. The rabbinic idea that by study we come to be better people is an important idea, even in such abstract areas as military ethics, where you might say to yourself, but this isn't going to come up to me. But it's important to understand that by being ethically attuned, you become a better voter, a more ethical person, and you begin to analyze complex issues in light of the things that you know and have learned. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of the same topic. One aspect of the topic is called war law, which is the process of deciding when it is proper and appropriate for a nation to go to war, what in the Catholic religious tradition is called just war theory. When is it proper for a society to go to war? The second area, which seems to be related and which we also call war ethics, is actually a very different topic, which is it says, when I am in a just war which I am fighting, what are the rules of battlefield ethics? How do I go about fighting with an enemy in front of me right now? And how do I decide whether it's proper to kill a particular person in a particular situation? Just war theory is widely discussed in the Talmud and much less discussed by the medieval Jewish law authorities, who intuit that as Jewish nationalism ends, the idea of the Jewish nation going to war diminishes. Notwithstanding that fact, the Rambam tells us, and the Maimonides is unique among the medieval Jewish law authorities in that he codifies all of Jewish law, even those aspects of Jewish law that he didn't see practiced in front of him, that there is something called just war theory. And Maimonides articulates the grandest view of just war theory. Maimonides tells us that it's proper and appropriate for one society to go to war with another society in order to make that other society behave properly and to impose decency on your neighbors, at least when they have started to attack you. So Maimonides adopts the grandest view of just war, maybe even something that he doesn't know is the Catholic tradition, but is in fact the Catholic tradition, which is you are permitted to go to war in order to accomplish grand ethical goals in the context of your unethical neighbors. So Maimonides thinks that when you have neighbors around you who are behaving badly, they are slaughtering innocent civilians, their own innocent civilians, but they are slaughtering them. You are justified as a good society in imposing your moral values, your good moral values, on the uncivilized people around you. The purpose of a societal just war is to make your uncivilized neighbors or your barbaric neighbors behave properly and justly. The grandest application of war is not merely to be defensive, it's to impose upon the society around you an ethical duty. Of course, Maimonides acknowledges to us that defensive wars can be justified beyond that. Defensive wars can be justified simply because you have been attacked and you must defend yourself. And Maimonides draws elaborate, complex procedural differences between defensive wars, which can be fought almost without full authorization, simply because you are merely defending yourself, and other kinds of wars, which are wars designed to make the world a more civilized and just place. What the Rambam distinguishes between in Hebrew is what we'll call Milchemet Mitzvah, wars that are a divine commandment to fulfill, which the Rambam thinks we would call in English defensive wars. When you are attacked, you must defend yourself. And Milchemet Rishut, authorized wars, which the Rambam understands to mean wars that your society has chosen to undergo. The word Rishut in Hebrew has this ambiguity of both authorized and merely permissible rather than mandatory, which is wars designed to make the world a better place and to civilize the otherwise uncivilized. Of course, permissive wars require a much greater procedural threshold of government. They require greater authorization. They're by their very nature not mandatory because you have not been attacked. But the Rambam acknowledges, Maimonides is insistent, that part of the mission all good people have is to eradicate the evil around us. Sometimes we do this as an individual. I see something wrong on my block and I get involved. Sometimes I do this as a police officer in my society. And sometimes we as a society look up and say, you know, the society next to us is perpetuating a terrible moral wrong, and we should intervene in order to ensure that the world is a more just place. That activity is discretionary, but encouraged. Defensive wars are by their very nature mandatory. The Ravid, Rabbi Abraham, the son of David, of what we would now call Provence, Maimonides' great antagonist in his writing of his code, stops and notes that he thinks Maimonides has overplayed his hand. And actually, in the real world of Jewish law, there is no obligation to impose justice on your neighbors. Wars are by their nature defensive or merely of benefit to the nation that is fighting them. And so to speak, if the Ravid, if Maimonides' protagonist were speaking in the 21st century, he would say there is no obligation upon the Jew to be the world's policeman. We don't have to go from place to place ensuring that every place is good. We have to make sure instead that we take care of ourselves. We need to build a just society. We need to be enabled to fight defensive wars, and we need to be able to fight permissive wars when it is in our own long-term best interest to do so. But we're not, the Ravid insists, the world's policeman. The commentaries on the Rambam, the later Rishonim, the later medieval authorities, spend a great deal of time, effort, and energy discussing what exactly is a defensive war. This topic doesn't really interest us, mostly because, being medievalists, they have a very narrow idea of war. And this is worth understanding what has categorically changed. We are a community in Pennsylvania, so I had no choice but to focus on the Battle of Gettysburg, a wonderful battlefield to this day. One of the last great battles in America, really the last great battle. And what's most interesting about it is how ancient the battle was. There was a battlefield that was approximately 5 miles by 5 miles, about 300,000 soldiers. I will call them men here because that was what they were in the Civil War, came to do battle. About 50,000 were killed, injured, or missing. And missing meant dead in Talmudic, in the Civil War, an enormous casualty rate. And yet, if you tour the Gettysburg battlefield, they note to you that there was only one civilian casualty in this massive battle. And this is because until relatively recently, battles had battlefields. And if you didn't want to be on the battlefield, you know what you did? You left. You left. You saw the Union and Confederate forces were massing in Gettysburg, and either you were a soldier on one side or another, or you were a villager in Gettysburg, and you know what you did? You got out. And the most powerful weapon the Union and the Confederate armies had in Gettysburg was a cannon, and no cannon could shoot more than about 900 yards. And there was a marked off battlefield. And if you didn't want to be a combatant, you got off the battlefield. Battlefield ethics thus attracted very little enormous discussion in pre-modern times because everybody knew who was a combatant. Combatants were the people who wanted to be on the battlefield. People who did not want to be on the battlefield left it. They left it. What's happened in modern times, really around World War I, is the scope of the battlefield enormously expanded. And defining battlefield ethics thus became very difficult. I always tell people that, I graduated from rabbinical school and I graduated from law school, and I participate in class lists on both of them. And the rabbinical school class lists, no matter how important you are, everybody posts on their class list that they're doing nothing important and I'm a nobody from nobody. Doesn't matter where they're really the chief rabbi of. It's the art of humility. And my law school classmates, no matter how unimportant they are, they tell us they're the most important people in the world. And I have a law school classmate who tells us that he flies drones for the CIA over Afghanistan. I have no idea if it's true or not, but I'll assume for the purposes of this conversation that it's true. And it signals to us that I no longer have any good idea who's really a combatant, because he can sit in his home in Maryland, drive to his office, I'm going to say the CIA headquarters, but I actually have no idea, and fly a plane as a combatant over Afghanistan, thousands of miles away, and yet he is clearly a combatant. This has given rise in the last 50 to 75 years to a very hard and complex conversation about not starting wars, but fighting wars. When and in what situation are we comfortable labeling people combatants? Is a soldier who's wearing a uniform, but who serves in the laundry brigade a combatant? Is the soldier who's a chef a combatant? Is Bob Hope, when he used to go to Vietnam, a combatant? Are civilians who work in munition factories combatants? This has created an enormously complicated Jewish law conversation about how to think about when a person is a combatant. And even as we are fighting a battle, who are we really allowed to wage a war against? And there are very different and competing theories in Jewish law, and it's been magnified and made more complicated by the presence, almost now the routine presence, of guerrilla warfare, where combatants don't readily identify themselves, and it's very hard to determine who really is an enemy, because the enemy does not identify themselves anymore consistent with the rules of war. This has given rise to 5 basic views within the Jewish tradition about how to think about battlefield ethics. One school of thought says that battlefield ethics is absolutely limited to combatants, and there are no circumstances in Jewish law in which it is ever permitted to kill a non-combatant. Non-combatants are innocent civilians, and as innocent civilians, they may never be killed. The second school of thought says this first school of thought is absolutely correct with a one-word modification. Innocent civilians may never be killed intentionally, but innocent civilians sometimes are used as shields. And while your aim is to kill the combatants, you cannot be restricted to fighting combatants who are hiding among innocent civilians. Innocent civilians can be killed unintentionally. And the third school of thought sort of steps a little bit farther back, and it distinguishes between innocent civilians who are essentially supportive of the combatants and provide them with assistance in every way other than by bearing arms, and arguing in a wholesale societal war, people who support the enemy, they give them food, they provide refuge for them, they too are combatants. And the school one step over to that says, don't be ridiculous. In modern war, everybody is a combatant. This view was first articulated not by any great Jewish law authority, but this view was first articulated by Winston Churchill in the policy of civilian bombings over Germany, which is simply go over German cities and drop bombs on apartment buildings. And when you ask Churchill to explain why, the British argued that every German was complacent in the crimes committed by the Nazis. And the final view is that there's no indigenous Jewish law here, and Jewish law permits people to follow whatever is the international law that governs their act of combat. This view, by the way, is very similar to the view the Bush administration took in Afghanistan, where the Bush administration drew a rigorous distinction between combatants and terrorists and argued that international law did not restrict how they fought military activity against terrorists. That's a famous Supreme Court case called Hamidiyah, named after a prisoner taken that the United States government would not release. And it was on that theory that people were detained in Guantanamo for an exceptionally long time, because international law doesn't govern the detention of prisoners who are not wearing a uniform at the time of their detention. All of this sort of allows us to reflect on the complexity of modern times. The value the Jewish tradition puts forward here, I think, fits into two big ideas. The first, which is what we opened with, is this dispute between Maimonides and others about whether what the Jewish tradition really wants from us in war is to make the others around us civilized. Or is war simply a tool we use to protect our own society? But there's no ethical duty to protect other innocent societies. Maimonides says it's a good thing to protect other innocent societies. And Ravid, Rabbi Abram ben David of Provençal, is much more hesitant to adopt that view and thinks it's mistaken. And then the second grand conversation is about how to go about fighting an ethical war in the reality of the world we live in now, where it's impossible to really fight on a battlefield. Battlefields like Gettysburg no longer exist. Battles are fought almost between economies, almost between every single working person in one society against every single working person in another society. And how do you figure out in that model who is a combatant and who is not? The Jewish tradition participates mightily in this dispute. I think the consensus is inclined against Maimonides on the first matter and doesn't think that we have to be the world's policeman, although I'm not sure. And on the second matter, I've always found comfort in Justice Jackson's observation. Justice Jackson says the United States Constitution is not a suicide pact. And although he didn't say it about Jewish law, I think it's a truism about Jewish law as well. Halacha is not a suicide pact, and it can't impose upon a Jewish society rules of war that ensure that the Jewish society always loses. The greatest tragedies in the Jewish tradition are when, in the immortal words of Billy Joel, we don't quote enough Billy Joel in Jewish law conversations, when the good die young. It's a tragedy when the good guys lose, and we shouldn't allow Jewish law to be constructed around the model of only the good dying young. I see that 4 people have posted chats, but it's exceptionally hard for me to read the chats and lecture, and I'll leave it to others to raise the questions in the chat, or you can reach out to me privately. My email address is mbroid@emory.edu, and you can also Google me and find my Emory address if that's not enough for you. I turn to Dr. I don't see him on the screen anymore. Dr. Nyberg and Rabbi Pardo, both of whom are going to respond, and then we'll have a dialogue. Thank you both very much for joining with me. And thank you, Noah, for being the incredible, diligent public servant that the Jewish community craves and doesn't have enough of. If our Jewish community was run by Noah Levine, the Messiah would have arrived already. Thank you.
Rabbi Pardo, do you want to start?
No, go ahead, please. I'm just.
Oh, okay. If you want me to. First of all, I want to thank Noah as well for the opportunity to be part of this. And I just want to say what the lawyers at the U.S. Army War College would like me to say, which is that I'm speaking in a personal capacity only, and that everything I'm about to say does not represent the views of the United States Army or any institution thereof. So now I've got that out of the way. When we were putting this together, my thoughts went to a book called The Utility of Force, written by a man named Rupert Smith, a retired 2-star general from the British Army, and his Israeli wife, Ilana Bet-El. And what they argued in this book is based in part upon their observations of Israel's issues with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with Hamas in Gaza. And what they argued was for something that they called war among the people. And this is also based on General Smith's observations commanding British forces in the Balkans in the 1990s. And what he argued is very complex, but I'm going to just briefly note 3 things that he said were true of modern war. He said, 1, in wars among the people, there is an impulse that is very different from the industrial wars of the 20th century, World War I and World War II in particular, where the goal on both sides is to reduce casualties, both one side's own casualties and, in fact, the casualties of the other side. That is, to conduct your operations while creating as little damage as possible. Now, obviously, what the Russians are doing, even as we speak, may be quite different from that, but that this has been true of what they call war among the people. The second feature that I want to highlight here is that in wars among the people, the battle space is public opinion. That is to say, you are fighting not just to win an operational goal, you are fighting to win the support of the entire global community. You're also fighting to make sure that your enemy does not have that support. And here you see what's going on in Ukraine coming through very clearly. And the third point they made is that wars among the people, unlike most of the wars that you see in modern history, have no clear beginning point and they have no clear ending point. That is to say that Israel's wars against Hamas and Gaza are not going to end with some sort of surrender ceremony or document. And I have yet to meet any Israeli scholars who can agree on when these wars exactly begin. One Israeli friend of mine said you can go back to the cooling of the earth if you want. That's obviously not a helpful concept. So in these wars, what Rupert Smith and Ilana Bet-El argue is that there are two parts of wars ethics that become exceptionally difficult. One is the concept of proportionality, which is to say, how do you respond when a terrorist group kills people on your side of a border? What is the response that you should use? And how much discrimination should you use? That is, what target sets should you hit? If a terrorist that is from the West Bank but goes to hide in Gaza, or even if that person leaves a territory that you control, what then do you do? The other aspect of this that Ilana and Rupert Smith talk about quite a lot is why a modern state would bother with the concept of battlefield ethics. Why would a modern military intentionally put their own soldiers at risk, which you may do if you're going to follow these ethical guidelines? Why would you intentionally hamstring yourself and do something that might make your battlefield operations less effective? And what they talk about and what we talk about a lot at the Army War College is, of course, a couple of things. What I've heard from many of my Israeli friends, that if one side becomes barbaric, that doesn't mean that you're going to do it too. You want to hold the moral high ground for your own sense of who you are as a society and what it is that you're fighting for. But the other issue, and the one that General Smith and Ilana would talk about, I think most, is that you are fighting a war always in an arena of global competition, and always in an arena of public opinion, and always to be thinking about the military thing that you're trying to accomplish, not just in what it will achieve in the next week or next month, but what it's going to achieve in the long term. So they argue that it's important for Western militaries, all militaries, to do this in order to keep that moral high ground, in order to keep that position in where you want to be. And obviously, as you all know, when Israel steps over that line, it takes more criticism than when terrorists step over that line very often, because the expectation is that terrorist organizations will do that, but that modern nation states are not supposed to. Finally, I think the last point that I would want to make is that war is continuing to change. It's continuing to evolve. If we had done this a month ago, we would have been speaking in a very different context than the one that we're talking about right now. But the Augustinian peace theory that the rabbi began with when we started talking here has been around since the Middle Ages. These concepts are not going away anytime soon, so they're very important for us to talk about. They're vital to the curriculum where I teach at the Army War College. And as he said also, as the rabbi said to begin with, it's important that we study and think about these things, if for no other reason than to sharpen our intellect and sharpen our approach to them. So I'll stop there and then let my distinguished colleague continue.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I lost internet there for a moment. I was completely off the radar for a second there. Well, thank you, Rabbi Brody and Professor Nyberg. First of all, I appreciate this, and I appreciate everybody here. Thank you all for being here, and Noah and Paulette and Rebecca. Thanks for putting everything together for West Shore. It's really well appreciated. Everything in theory, when it comes to ethics and battlefield ethics, it's great. Theory is amazing, and find yourself sometime as a military on active duty person on active duty or reserves in the battlefield, guided by politicians that sent you there because it was not always a military decision. Most of the time it's a political decision by whoever's pulling the strings over the military. And as a soldier, you find yourself sometime at a point that you understand what you need to do, but it's not exactly as you were taught. And you're faced with situations that are very difficult and challenging. What are you going to do? You know what the right thing to do is. By the way, Israel is the very high moral values. The Israel Defense Force is with very high moral values. So we actually are pretty much not shooting at anybody until we're being shot at. So it's a very restrained reaction to violence against us. I just want to tell a little story. During the time Israel was in Lebanon and Hezbollah and Palestinians, terrorists were constantly attacking Israel from Lebanon. And Israel went in to create a security belt and managed to gather 5,000 terrorist suspects at a camp in southern Lebanon. 5,000, from young teens all the way to a lot older people, and they were in a camp guarded by Israel's security forces. And at the same time, shortly after, the number came to 5,000, 6 Israeli soldiers were caught in a bunker inside Lebanon, in their shorts, caught off guard, and taken hostage by the terrorist organization, Hezbollah there. Then Israel was faced with this ethical dilemma, and what do we do now? They said they would release the 6 Israeli soldiers in exchange of the 5,000 terror suspects and known terrorists that were held in that camp. And there was an agreement that it happened, and the United Nations came in and gave all the 5,000 terrorists pretty much new jumpsuits and white sneakers and released them into Lebanon, all over the place, everywhere. And they were walking by all the Israeli camps there and like this with, And I know from a lot of my colleagues that they had to restrain themselves from just shooting into this crowd of terrorists walking like this, because they were extremely upset about the government's decision to do this exchange of prisoners for kidnapped soldiers. The Jewish tradition tells us if you save one life, it's like you save the whole world, and that's basically what we operate on. And the decision was, again, it was a political decision. It was not a military decision to do that, but that's what they did, and that's what was done. And again, like it or not, you're under the your commanding officer, under so forth and so forth, and then it goes to the Minister of Defense, who's under the Prime Minister, and the government is the one that decides what you're going to do. One thing I have to say, when Ariel Sharon, may rest in peace, was the defense minister in Israel, there were no roadside bombs and attacks on the soldiers who were stationed in Lebanon. As soon as that changed after the big scandal of Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, and Moshe Arens, Professor Arens came in and he became the defense minister, all of a sudden, these roadside bombs started. And they started to kill the Israeli soldiers right and left inside Lebanon. So political situations and politics have a lot to do with the way you act in the battlefield and what goes on there. And I don't have to say much about what's going on now in Ukraine. It is obviously there's no reason to be attacking a neighboring country except for political gains. Very sad. that's about it. I have a lot more to talk about, but our time is limited. So I'm going to give it back to you, Noah, or whoever wants to. Is Ethel going to?
I think we open it up for the three of you.
Okay.
Professor Nyberg, I wonder if you could tell me if you think that the War College teaching successfully trained soldiers for the war or the battlefield or something else?
Well, I think, Rabbi Pardo hit the nail on the head, which is that you don't take this theory to the battlefield with you. You study it, you put it into your head, you hopefully have it as you're thinking things through before you get involved in what you're getting into. The people that I teach are colonels and lieutenant colonels. About a third of them will become general officers. So what we're really trying to do is get them to think about the importance of these things as they're building their strategies. So, Russia attacking Ukraine for clearly not in self-defense, clearly for aggression, clearly for all the wrong reasons, will have strategic impact for them. It will make this war harder for them to fight, harder for them to gain support. As you can see, much of the world kind of not even boycotting them now, embargoing them now. So we talk about all of those things, the importance of making sure that you're thinking about ethics as you're thinking about designing your strategy, making sure that you're talking to your soldiers about these issues, and making sure that you realize that it only takes one Abu Ghraib, one My Lai, one incident like that to turn an entire conflict and make what you may think is the right mission and turn it into the wrong one. So all of these issues are very important. I can say that we've had a lot of discussions, less so now as Iraq is starting to sort of fade in importance, but we had a lot of discussions among students at the War College about things that we did not build correctly into our, however you felt about the Iraq War of 2003, that there were ethical moments there, ethical chances to gain an upper hand, like protecting cultural sites, protecting museums, things like that, that were not built into the plan. And that ended up hurting American strategy and hurting the way that we were conceptualizing that war. Could we spend more time on it in our college? Of course we could, but there is a limited amount of time and we have to be judicious. I think we do it pretty well the way we have it. I would like to have more time, but that's not the world we live in, unfortunately.
Wonderful. And do you think that the ethics of the United States military is designed to deal with the threats that we're really confronting? The hardest part I've always found is the natural tendency of ethicists to discuss the last war rather than the next war.
I think the issue for me really is it's a different concept of war when you're dealing with a state actor than when you're dealing with a non-state actor. Dealing with terrorists, dealing with an Al-Qaeda, dealing with an Islamic State, dealing with Hezbollah is just a different type of problem than it is dealing with the state actor. Although maybe I shouldn't say that given what the Russians have been up to the last couple of weeks. But I'm not sure that it's looking back at the last war and getting it wrong rather than trying to figure out what the enemy is, what's motivating that enemy, what to do and how to respond when the enemy crosses a line. You have to, as Rabbi Pardo said, you have to not cross that line yourself. You have to make sure that you're keeping to your laws, your ethics, your training, and your standards. And that can be a very, very difficult thing to do. It's easy to study it. It's easy to talk about it. It's much harder to make those decisions in the heat of the moment. But I tell people, I use the line from The Godfather, this is the life you've chosen. So you have to live with those parameters. You have to live with those ethical constraints, and you have to live with the reality, as Rabbi Pardo said, that the critical decisions will be made by civilians in many cases. They'll be made by politicians. And that's just the nature of a military system. And that's the nature of the business that they're in. So they have to be aware of the way the system actually functions.
Question is, could someone expand on how public opinion, the opinions of non-combatants, matter in fighting a war?
Just in a minute, I'm going to let one of my esteemed colleagues answer this question. But I just wanted to mention that it's definitely different for people who chose to have a military career to those in Israel that have to serve because it's mandatory service for 3 years. And then you can make the decision if you're going to stay or get out. And I know a lot of people just get out because they disagree with how much politics are going to be involved in that. So I'm sure it's the same thing in the US when people make a decision to join or not join the military.
It is, and there's actually been a question in law and ethics whether conscripts can be held to the same standard. That is, if someone is forced to join the military, are they ethically responsible? And I think it's interesting that the oath that an officer takes in the US military is to the Constitution. The oath that a non-commissioned officer takes is to obey the orders of their officers. So legally and ethically, that responsibility is pushed up. That's not to say that a conscript can get away with whatever a conscript feels they can get away with, but there is an understanding that someone that's forced in, of course, now we don't have conscription in the US, but in a state like Israel where there is conscription, that there has to be a different ethical moral line, that the people training, educating, and preparing those soldiers have to bear a higher responsibility almost than the ones who are executing the orders. And you know, it's always important to remember my students are fairly senior officers. They're in their 40s, but it's important to remember that most of these young people are 18, 19, 20 years old. And I think that has to be taken into account as well. They're very young.
And we do have, actually, we are taught in the Israeli military that if you're supposed to obey, of course, your commanding officer, whether you're an officer or not. If it's a senior officer, you still have to obey them. But if they ask you to do something that's not in line with the morals of the military, then you just don't do it.
Correct. You have an obligation to
Don't
disobey
just
an illegal order.
Absolutely.
Right.
It doesn't
Right.
matter if you're a private or if you're a lieutenant colonel. If you have a commanding officer telling you to do something that's not within our general morals of the Israeli military, you just don't do it.
Yep, exactly.
The problem in the real world, of course, is that the private frequently doesn't know enough facts to
Correct.
even detect an illegal order.
Correct. Or is 18 years old and terrified of a 35-year-old major who is screaming at him. But that again does not absolve an individual from the responsibility to follow the laws of war.
We see it within the police force in the US of what happened in Minneapolis. That was senior officer is killing someone right in front of you, and the other 3 officers are just standing idly by.
Yeah.
My congregation, we talked about it in one of my services. I said, if I were one of those officers, I would jump that officer. It doesn't matter if he's a senior officer to me. He's doing something that's not acceptable and is wrong, morally wrong, and you should defend the civilian in that case if you see a senior officer doing something wrong.
And I think that gets back to the
taught in the military in Israel.
Let's get back to the point I was making earlier. When an army or a police force crosses that line, you can see what the response is from people. They have less faith and less trust in that institution. That institution has to work harder to build that trust back. So we talk about that a lot, that we call it the strategic corporal phenomenon, meaning that if one young person at 20 years old does something stupid in a place like Abu Ghraib, does something illegal, immoral, unethical, it can have tremendous ramifications. So that officers have a responsibility to, at the very least, make clear to their soldiers, this is what I consider to be crossing that line. But it is extremely difficult to do because very few cases are that cut and dry.
And let me add, it's also very much about your sense of the ethics of the other, which is if you look at if you look at the British bombing of German cities in World War II, there was almost no British opposition to the bomber command's decision. There was some, but not much. There was a sense that the enemy were barbarians, and a little bit of barbarism back was ethically permissible.
Yeah, it's important to note, though, that the British were never 100% comfortable with that. The air commanders were the only ones left off the end of war Queen's or King's honors list. They were the last people to get a statue in London. And I was working in King's College archives, which is right across the street from where Arthur Harris, nicknamed Arthur Bomber Harris's memorial was.
Bomber Harris, right.
I was there when a crowd of people just came up and dumped red paint over that statue to make the point. And this was in 2002 10, I think. So again, this sense that there was a sort of ethical line that the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command had crossed was still powerful enough that in 2010, it could motivate a group of young people to bring a can of red paint and throw it on a statue right there in the Strand. And that matters. It matters for even the way the RAF thinks about itself today. It matters in the way that the Air Force, our Air Force, the United States Air Force, has tried very hard since World War II to make its munitions as accurate as possible so that they can be as discriminate as possible. In other words, they're hitting the targets that they should hit while not hitting the targets they shouldn't hit.
Let me just interrupt that. We're going to save all the questions. We're going to send them to our speakers. Hopefully you can respond, send them back to us so that we can then send to you, because clearly we want to have time. There's a million questions in the chat. There is one. Are target assassinations the warfare of the future?
You know, this is actually an area where Israel was at the forefront. And in fact, I wrote this down right here. See, I had it. That was where I was going to go if I had more time to kill. These are Israeli lawyers led the thinking in this. When is it okay in the era of drone warfare and precision guided munitions? When is it okay to target an individual? And it is the Israeli initial thinking on this that the United States government then followed, first in the Bush administration and then in the Obama administration. And this is the way it works. Since I just had this right here, I'll just go through it real quick. There are 5 criteria. You have to know that the person you're targeting actually has blood on his hands, that is, was directly responsible for a terrorist attack or other killing. 2, you can't have, if you have a reasonable chance to arrest this person, you have to go for an arrest, not a killing. 3, you can't do the killing on your own soil. So that is, the United States can't target a terrorist with a drone on American soil. Israelis can't do it on Israeli soil. That's to protect your own, that's to protect the people that you're obviously trying to protect. 4, the risk of collateral damage has to be assessed as low. And 5, the order has to come from a defense minister, prime minister, or president. Those are the 5 criteria that were laid out. Now, whether you think that that's ethical or legal or sufficient is up to your own conscience and your own ethics. But I had that ready to go in part because it was something that was specifically introduced by Israeli lawyers.
So basically, you just described the person that has direct blood on their hands and so forth. If I'm reading all these 5 things you said, you're just waiting for Biden to just order the drone to be sent to the Kremlin?
So I think there's 5 asterisks. The person in charge can't have his finger on nuclear weapons buttons. I think that there's an asterisk to that one. I just had an Air Force friend of mine tell me that it's only a no-fly zone if you have dominance over the airspace. If the no-fly zone includes another nuclear power, then it could be the end of humanity. That's not a no-fly zone. That's a third world war. So whether we like it or not, the rules are different for states that have nuclear weapons.
This list, what Israel goes by, obviously, is to eliminate heads of terrorist organizations. It's not directed at heads of state. So
Correct.
I think that that's an important idea. Political leadership and is not the same as other forms of leadership. Political leadership have never been subject to this kind of assassination. While General Yamamoto in Japan is killed, the leadership of Japan is not killed. The political leadership is not killed.
Yeah.
Hitler was never targeted.
Yeah, that's true.
we did go after Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, though. So
Yeah.
Is there
again, I
anything
think
in Jewish tradition about when and how a war should be ended?
To some extent, Noah, the dispute between Maimonides and those who disagree with him is very much about this. Maimonides maintains that wars should end when the other side has agreed to be civilized. And Maimonides' protagonists say wars should end when the other side has agreed to be peaceful to you. Those are not at all the same if you think about them in the biggest of pictures. Many times we enter into peace agreements with those who oppose us in which we let them remain bad in their home society so long as they are no longer threatening us. What made World War II unique was our decision to redo the enemy society in our image. But most of the time, we don't adopt this Maimonidean model of making the evil good. We instead just adopt the model of making the evil peaceful.
You know, the First World War case is one that I teach here a lot. As that war was beginning to come to an end, the Allied commander Ferdinand Foch, a Frenchman, made the argument that as soon as the Germans lay down their weapons and I can get them to come to the peace table on our terms, then I have a moral obligation to stop the war, because everybody that dies after that point, that blood's on my hands. Other people, the American commander John Pershing was one of them, said, no, we should drive into Germany, go all the way to Berlin if you have to, but put an exclamation point on the end of this. And Foch argued that whatever political difficulties it would create, the ethical thing to do was to stop the killing at the very first moment that he could do it. Beyond that, it was up to the politicians. So that's kind of reflected in this Maimonidean dialogue that we're talking about as well. Do you stop the war when the people on the other side are no longer a threat to you, or do you stop the war when you can create greater justice across the board? And we also teach a lot about this wonderful comment of Henry Kissinger's, that peace and justice very often work against one another. That is, in order to get justice for the Ukrainian people, we have to risk the end of peace, so that the two concepts do not always work together. And it's sometimes a question of which of those two things you want to pursue more, peace or justice.
The thing that we have to remember when we talk about Israel, for example, again, I will be talking about Israel because it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about. It's called the Israel Defense Force. That's why it's IDF. And it was created to defend Israel against the attacks from the Arab countries around and the Arabs that lived within the borders of Israel. And it is exactly what it is. It's Israel Defense Force. As for ending wars or ending this eternal conflict that we have in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians, it's the same story again and again. If their platform of Hamas says that they're calling for the destruction of Israel. So if the platform of your enemy is calling for your destruction, how are you going to be seated around the table and negotiate? Any ideas, Rabbi Brody or Professor?
No, it's very hard to figure out whether there is whether all that there is in Israel is what they call mowing the grass, which is keeping the status quo stable and reducing conflict. Sometimes there's no peace. Sometimes all there is reducing conflict, because the war is unwinnable. And if the war is unwinnable, then maybe the peace is just stability rather than justice. There is undoubtedly a tension between peace and justice, and sometimes justice is unachievable, and all that you can go for is some sort of tranquility. This is not just about the current Israeli model. This is more generally about the inability to successfully wage certain wars. The inability to wage certain wars requires that you acknowledge that the evil can't be eradicated, and all that you can do is live with the most stability that you can have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, please.
No, go ahead.
No, I want your comments. That's why.
I was just going to say that I had this conversation with an Israeli one-star in Tel Aviv a couple of years ago. And I asked him the question, we were talking about kind of 3-month plans and 6-month plans. And I said, what is the 20-year plan? In other words, what kind of a strategic situation do you want to leave to the next generation of senior Israeli leaders? And his answer was, that's not what I'm paid to do. My thinking has to be 3 to 6 months out. And so later on in the day, we were having coffee and lunch, and I came back to that with him. And I said, if you were thinking 20 years down the line, and your goal 20 years down the line was to have both peace and justice, what could you be doing right now, as the US Army would say, to shape that future? And what it came down to, he said, well, first of all, he was very pessimistic that that was going to happen. He thought this was, an eternal conflict that is never going to change in its fundamentals. But I did at least get him to say that holding to an ethical standard of war and holding to these concepts of proportionality and just response were ways to increase the odds of having a better future. And violating those ethical standards was a way to guarantee that it would be harder to get to. So there is an ethical dimension to the long-term strategy if you're going to hold to that.
And back to what we were talking about before, that you can target the head of a terrorist organization or a terrorist operative, but you don't target a head of state or a political leader. What happened with Hamas is that the terrorist organization became a political leadership of the Gaza Strip, and now you find line. What do you do with that? And I truly believe that the simple people, both in Gaza and the West Bank, are not interested in fighting or in wars or in killing. They just want to live lives peacefully, just like every Israeli, every Jewish Israeli, the same, like most Israelis. Let's say most people. Unfortunately, there are people that pulling the strings from the political side, and even worse now when, as I said, a terrorist organization becomes a political leadership, like in the Gaza Strip, or when they had the caliphate as well. I mean, we have other problems with Muslim terrorists outside Israel that the rest of the world is facing as well. What do you do then? How do you tackle the? You can have much better dialogue with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, in Ramallah, and then there's like no dialogue with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And they're both Palestinian people, right? It's Palestinian people that live here and Palestinian people that live there. So how do you? It's very hard to handle this when you have this political pulling and pushing from different sides. And
I'm going to have to interrupt because of time, and I'm going to ask everyone to make one final statement, and then we're going to close.
Michael, why don't you go first? Because you're clearly the most articulate among us.
Me?
Yes. Yo.
I mean, I guess, I would just come back to what, my training as an historian and my thinking as an historian, which is there are certainly moments where states or armies have crossed this line. My Lai is one that stands out in my mind a lot, that make it extremely difficult, not just for a military, but for an entire state and political system to recover. So these things matter both for the way in which we conduct ourselves in armed conflict, but also in the ways our perception of ourselves and the perception that others have of us. And those things do matter. So getting back to your point earlier, these are things that have to be studied. They're studied by the professionals that I work with, but they should be studied much more broadly as well. These are important national subjects.
Rabbi Pardo?
I just want to, first of all, thank you again for being here and for doing all this, and for everyone who has joined us today. I hold Jews to a different standard, and it's as terrible as it may sound. I think that we should know better. When I hear about a Jewish person doing anything bad, and sometimes on the news you can hear it, whether it's a politician or whether it's a financial manager or whatever it is, that is involved in a scandal or something bad, I said, how can a Jewish person do that? And perhaps it's my background from Israel, perhaps it's being a rabbi, perhaps it's the Israeli military, I don't know what it is. But I think we should all support Israel, but also, don't boycott Israel, support Israel, don't boycott Israel, but also do some constructive criticism and get involved if you want things to change in the Israeli field and what's going on in Israel. First of all, you can always make an aliyah and go run for office and make changes there. It's very easy to, as mentioned before. In theory, things are much more different than on the ground. So when you're on the battlefield or whether you're anywhere, theory is one story, and matter of fact, what's really happening is a different story. So be always mindful of that. That's what I would to do. And thanks again.
I want to affirm Rabbi Pardo's comment about living in Israel. 3 of my children have moved to Israel, and my daughter works for the government of Israel in the Ministry of Science and Technology, and you can move to Israel and be a success and even be a politician. But to me, the great dilemma of Jewish life generally is what we say on Yom Kippur, which is we want truth and peace to live together. Emet v'shalom yachdav. The truth and peace of life lives together, but it isn't always possible. Sometimes the peace of life can't live successfully with the truth of life. And these are the dilemmas created in military ethics, where what we really want are both values fully manifest in difficult and complicated ways. Thank you all very much for coming here, and thank you to the organizers, Noah, Ethel, and so many other people who were involved in putting this together.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Roy, Professor Nieberg, and Rabbi Pardo. This concludes our program. Rabbi Roy will send his responses to your chat questions to us, and we will forward them to you. Also, you'll receive a brief survey, which we ask you to complete. Our final program, Jewish Biomedical Ethical Issues, will take place Tuesday, April 26, 7 p.m., featuring Jonathan Crane, Emory Center of Ethics. Our panelist, Dr. Steve Berg, Shippensburg University Professor, History of Disease and Public Health, Dr. Stephen Wasser, Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, Pennsylvania State University College of Medicine. The chair of the meeting is Dr. Joe Levinstein, Adams County Jewish Community, Gettysburg, and a member of our community. We hope to see you then, and thank you for attending. We will keep the Zoom open for your convenience, and good night.
Thank you.